public disputes. Those are when the authorities are initiating an arrest and they press on with prosecution, and it doesn't have to depend solely on the victim bringing a complaint. Usually this standard of public dispute is recognized only if there is some kind of excessive violence or threat to public order. These being quite vague terms. But when this public dispute is initiated, the result can be fine, imprisonment, but many of these complaints were dropped or not pursued, and one suspects that judges made their decisions on these public disputes based on their own prejudices, not that there was any explicit standard of what constitutes excessive violence. A global history of domestic violence encounters the same problem. Not only we discuss problems defining what is a crime, how a crime is dealt with, but now we're turning to the problem of defining privacy, a word that was rarely used in English prior to the 18th century. And one way of thinking about privacy is its meaning as non-intervention by outside authorities in family relations. A man's home is his castle, one does not intrude. The other meaning of privacy is restriction or confinement of the women in the home. And in this case, men were restricting women's movement outside the home as they were jealous, as they saw women outside of the home as neglecting their responsibilities to the family, as they believed women were disobeying their commands about when and where they could go. Exactly what these restrictions were seemed to vary greatly by social class, since it would have been unrealistic for women of limited means to perform their duties and responsibilities without leaving the home and moving about. As it relates to domestic violence, the privacy of the home is operationalized in terms of non-disclosure or taboo, or keeping a secret, that is, not disclosing to outsiders that domestic violence has occurred. It becomes extremely confusing to decide whether one is discussing symbolic rhetoric about a man's home is his castle or actual restrictions on women's movement. It has been argued in much of the literature that industrialization in the West or colonialism in many regions conquered by the West created the concept of the family as private sphere. In fact, concepts of public and private that specifically relate to domestic violence permeate all of world history and many epochs. One truly needs to put aside as folk belief the idea that the separation of public and private was the result of the development of the bourgeoisie in the global north during the 19th century. I quote Victor Uribe on this. He refers to this sharp public domestic dichotomy to be not only an organizing fiction of social life, but an academic fiction as well. The global history of domestic violence cannot be written without sustained attention to rank, or what we would call social class. Almost everywhere, the belief is held that domestic violence is more common, more tolerated among the lower classes. The fact that in every study of domestic homicide, the incidence of domestic violence is greater among people of lesser means suggests there is much truth in this stereotype. Higher incidence is probably related to stressful living conditions, limited opportunities for improvement, and the theory of social psychologists that frustration leads to aggression. But if you think about how long this idea has been around, it is not the case, as English historians want to claim, that it begins in, say, in the 18th century. You can find it in the Talmud, which associated wife abuse with boorish, poorly educated males, thus pushing the origins of the idea of domestic violence related to lower social class about 2 centuries before the Common Era. Defining by domestic violence by class has implications as well for ideas about masculinity and femininity. The man of higher rank was reinvented as a man of self-control, governed by norms of civility. But the more demonstrable point is that people on higher ranks always had a concept of family reputation or family honor, and this is many cultures, which freights revelation of domestic violence with the aura of scandal and places a greater burden on a woman from this strata of society who reveals her suffering. Women of lower orders, it can be said, felt little shame because of being abused and suffered little or less stigma in appealing to public forums for help. Lacking in shame, such women were also well-schooled in fighting back against a violent husband. Where there is empire, there's also a great class difference in domestic violence, which is overlaid on racial or national differences. Thus, the indigenous man was portrayed as less civilized, more barbarous, more brutish. The indigenous woman could be more oppressed on one hand or seen as more immoral on the other. Again, these stereotypes could lead to severe punishment to bring civilization to the uncivilized, or the exact opposite, non-intervention because it was hopeless to do anything about this inherent brutality among the indigenous people. These contradictory attitudes could be found in colonial law itself or in the common division between the formal law of imperial nations and customary law. For example, colonial Spanish law used to punish Indian wife killers with pardons or dismiss sentences, since they were regarded as childlike and did not know better than the brutish behavior and drunkenness to which they were inclined. The creation of customary law did not necessarily mean that older ways of dealing with domestic violence were simply continued. Often, local native elites also had an interest in reinterpreting indigenous customs to control the population and attempt to achieve family stability. For example, battered women who fled their husbands in French-controlled Sudan, which is now Mali, had once been punished by a whipping. Under new customary law rules, they were charged with the crime of desertion and sent to prison. In sum, the global history of all domestic violence has altered the way we understand domestic violence. After several decades of avoiding the term patriarchy, the comparative history of domestic violence certainly reestablishes it and even introduces new types that amplify it, such as the patriarchal bargain. The fact that there were so many different definitions of household did nothing to diminish the significance of authority, sexuality, gender-defined household responsibilities as part of family history. But world history also suggests that we consider as well the significance of jealousy, frustration, and rage in intimate relationships. In colonial Mexico, for example, male violence against women was justified not as an exercise of discipline, but as a venting of masculine rage. In a fit of temper, a man struck out against whomever was nearby, often it was his wife. Honor and shame have been significant components of many cultures, developed and less developed, but cultures and honor and shame are difficult to ignore in writing about the history of Spain, Latin America, or the Middle East. The runaway wife is a staple of the global history of domestic violence, but also present is the reconciled wife, often the same woman as the runaway, who returned to the household from which she sought to flee, and the excusing wife, who went to court to withdraw the charges she brought against her husband. In general, world history reveals an expansion of the legal options for battered wives, with probably the greatest expansion since the 1990s. Most historians who study the transition of nations to republics come away disappointed in the degree to which the modernization of family law failed to benefit abused wives. The fact that the law does not work very well in favor of battered women worldwide has not deterred battered women from seeking access to it. This review has proceeded that it's possible to make some comparisons of various greatly diverse legal frameworks and procedures. That is an arguable point. But from the comparisons that I have made, world legal history does not confirm skepticism of global feminists about the significance of law for domestic violence. It finds women seeking out new legal opportunities whenever they are made available. I've argued that variations on the theme of patriarchy have been the most significant context for understanding the world history of domestic violence. Following other scholars, I found different types of patriarchy, related to religion, concepts of physical restriction of women, honor and shame, Candioti's patriarchal bargain. Well, I also, in this review, have emphasized that patriarchy appears to suffer the greatest challenges from the civilizing process, from nation building, that is the shift from empire to nation, and from feminism. These challenges, I also said, leave their imprint on the way the legal system responds to domestic violence. Well, the way we can see these cracks appearing is through this history of world legal systems and the way they have adjudicated and responded to domestic violence. And these changes in the law have had a positive impact in making domestic violence less natural and more problematic. But like all historical processes, the expectation for change was greater than the results, and the outcomes were often ambiguous.
Would you, when you ask a question, would you just say who you are?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'm getting my PhD in social work, and I'm looking at a treatment model for male offenders who are mandated. And I'm curious to hear what your position is on that, because from the literature I've read, the position of feminism is essentially, don't bother, it's worthless, and the only way we can change this is to change the patriarchal system.
This is probably you're asking a question that is above my pay grade, because it is there is a really huge literature on these no-drop policies and how well they work. And I would have to say that I am not well enough informed to speak to the efficacy of the policies. As a kind of general inclination, my own sense is that some kind of mandatory process or some kind of no drop or some kind of requirement to go into treatment program is necessary, and that, yes, I acknowledge that this is a form of coercion and that it does restrict the women's opportunities. But from my point of view, I'm looking at the rather huge and very long history of when this is a crime, and on the whole, you just see that the not only do the crimes dissolve because women don't want to press charges, but also that there is a sense that it it demoralizes the legal system itself, because they then have activated themselves on behalf of something that disappears or goes away. So in general, I'm sympathetic to some kind of coercive aspects of the state in this regard.
I have a follow-up.
Do you want to say what you think?
Well, what I'm wondering, and thank you for asking, because obviously I have an opinion, right? Is I agree there should be a mandate treatment model. I absolutely agree with that premise. My concern lies in the treatment model itself, that's been legislated often in many states, that I'm wondering if it isn't if we don't need a trauma-based treatment model, which would sort of explain why in times of stress, there's an accelerated outbreak, if you will, of domestic violence. It's consistent with the late onset of PTSD model as far as, you know, stress impacting responses and behavior systems and things like that. So that's the way at this point in time I'm approaching the topic. But I was curious to hear what you had to say about it, because it's so difficult when the treatment model is being defined by the feminists, and they don't seem to be interested in any other strategy. Do you have any suggestions?
No.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Bianca, and I thought that was
Yes, we met.
yeah, right. And I just wanted to say I thought that was a magisterial overview. I mean, hard to imagine how much you had to read to pack that much in. So thank you very much for that. It was helpful to me. I have two unrelated questions. One is more of an observation that's not quite formed yet, but it occurs to me that we may use different Western scholars, I should say, might use different definitions of coercion or protection when we're approaching the various institutions that have been set up for women who are the victims of gender-rooted violence. Which is to say that I was intrigued to hear you talk about special prisons. Of course, in colonial Spanish America, in colonial Brazil as well, in colonial Spain, it was common to put women into deposits or convents in order to protect them. And they also had special sequestration institutions called recogimientos that were set up for a combination of kind of both protection and punishment for wayward women. And so you always found a bit of commingling between protection and punishment for women. Yet we tend to not think about battered women's shelters as places that women end up against their will, when, of course, if they had their druthers, they probably wouldn't want to be there. And in some cases, they can't return home. So I wondered if you had any comments or if there's some work that could be done in comparing our approaches to these various institutions for protection or punishment. And I'll let you do that one, and I'll switch to just another quick question.
Well, just as a personal reaction, I just stumbled on these institutions in my reading for this paper, and and my background is United States history, and the United States history doesn't have that. What it does have is that wayward girls, there are female juvenile delinquents, often sexually active young women, might have been sent to juvenile institutions. But the problem here,